Hi there, welcome to OurCARE Podcast. My name is Ozla, and I'm the founder of OurCARE, which stands for Our Community Action for Research and Empowerment. I will be the host of this podcast where we discuss anything and everything related to being queer, migration, living with HIV, public health research and policies, and honestly, whatever else we feel the need to discuss and explore. To be honest, I wasn't quite sure how to start with this podcast series, and especially this first episode, simply because the perfectionist and the overthinker in me have been battling it out over these podcast recordings. I have drafted many scripts, did several trial shoots, and nothing worked the way I wanted it to work. And that gave me several anxiety attacks, which you can imagine didn't make me feel great. And today we're having a surprisingly sunny day in Zurich, and I'm feeling much better. And I wanted to just turn the cameras on, turn the lights on, start recording myself, and see what we're going to end up with. So here we are. The first goal of this podcast and these first couple of episodes is going to be introducing OurCARE to you and people involved in OurCARE to you. And since I love storytelling and I truly believe in the power of it, I thought following my own journey living with HIV and how it led to OurCARE would be a cute way of introducing us to you. So here we are. I have some of the notes that I have drafted in front of me, and I am just going to go with them and see what comes out of it. If this is your first time hearing me speak or watching me, in case you're watching this recording on YouTube, hi again, my name is Ozla. I'm a queer man living with HIV from Turkey. I am 5'8", brown eyes, hairy, curly, and I'm definitely not looking for a guy in finance. I'm currently based in Zurich, Switzerland, and we have a lot of finance bros in this city walking around in their expensive vests. And based on my personal experiences, I can tell you probably they're not it. But without me getting already distracted by men, let's continue. As I said, I'm currently based in Zurich, Switzerland. I have moved to Switzerland about 4 years ago for a master's degree in health sciences, in which I majored in health services research because I wanted to conduct research on accessibility of sexual health services, especially HIV services for key populations. I started this master's degree back in Istanbul during COVID, and I graduated 2 years ago. And currently I'm doing my second master's in social and cultural anthropology because apparently one wasn't enough. But my story starts way back. And when I was diagnosed with HIV, I was 22 years old and I was still living in Istanbul back then. I was kind of lost in life, and moving to Switzerland or doing master degrees were not even things that I would even imagine back then. And looking back, yes, now I can say HIV truly has changed a lot in my life, but surprisingly not in the ways that I thought it was going to change when I first got diagnosed. I wasn't completely ignorant of HIV when I was diagnosed because a close friend of mine at the time was diagnosed a year before me, but turns out I didn't really truly internalize this process. So although I knew I wasn't going to die and I could continue living with HIV thanks to effective treatment options, I still spent months crying in my room and acting as if my life is over. Turns out it wasn't. Instead of limiting me, HIV opened so many unexpected doors in my life, and I spent the past 9 years traveling around the world, chasing HIV conferences and capacity building programs, trying to make sense of my life. And while I was chasing conferences and capacity building programs, I met so many people either living with HIV or affected by HIV. And we were all working to improve the quality of life for our communities and for ourselves. And this was truly amazing. And as I said, so much happened in the past 9 years that I've been living with HIV. What can I tell you about those 9 years in a nutshell? I have migrated 3 times or 4 times, depending on how you count it. I have finished 2 degrees. I volunteered at NGOs in Turkey or European NGOs and also international NGOs and youth movements. I have traveled to more than, 30 countries, and I don't even know how many conferences. I became a youth ambassador for International AIDS Society, representing young people living with and affected by HIV. And during my first master's degree, I started writing for a UK-based platform summarizing HIV-related research findings. After finishing my first master's degree, I basically landed my dream job. I started working for the global network of young people living with HIV. I was running projects in more than 10 countries, working with sex workers, people who use drugs, queer communities within the sexual health and reproductive health and rights space. And I truly loved it. But a few months ago, I realized I was going towards a burnout, or maybe I was already there. I was working at my dream job, traveling around the world constantly, trying to integrate into civil society, build myself a life here while continuing my studies. And of course, the most traumatizing of them all, I was also still trying to date men. At the end, it was all too much. I felt like I was losing myself while trying to hold everything together. So I quit my job. I started therapy again. And now, after a few months of procrastination and feeling lost, I decided to launch OurCARE, a platform to tell our stories and advocate for our rights. And that's basically what I hope to do with this podcast as well. Over the past 9 years, I've been lucky enough to, as I said, travel around the world and build a network of friends and colleagues who are all working within the HIV or broader sexual and reproductive health and rights space. I want to invite them into the conversation. Together, we will talk about what it means to live at the intersection of HIV, queerness, migration, and rising homophobia and transphobia around the world. Well, the whole world is collapsing on us, kind of. And we will do this while also following what is happening at the HIV science space. I seem to be collecting these degrees, so I need to dive into the science and policy a little bit to make use of them. And we will do that. And sometimes we will break down complicated policies and research full of jargon, and we will try to translate them into something that actually speaks to our daily lives. And other times we'll basically just share our stories, voice our needs, and remind each other that we are not alone and our lives and our feelings matter. I hope this podcast to be about connection, understanding, and giving voice to the issues that affect us. I wish to take the conversations we already have in our communities and bring them here for us to discuss openly and grow together. But as I said, I want to start this series by following my own journey with HIV. And for that, I need to take you back to 2016. That is when I was diagnosed with HIV. As I said, I was 22 years old. I was still studying for a bachelor's degree at this conservative university in Istanbul. I remember sometimes I wouldn't be allowed into the university cafeteria because of my outfits. And sometimes they would also remove knives from the cafeteria because people were getting stabbed. Crazy times. But in a way, it all started with me breaking up from my boyfriend back then. And after our relationship ended, I went on some chaotic rebound sex cycle, which led to my HIV diagnosis. People used to ask me a lot if I know who I got HIV from. I don't, and I actually never tried to find it out. I wasn't really interested in pointing fingers and blaming someone that I had sex with, but I was more interested in understanding what was happening in my body and how was I supposed to continue living and building my future. And basically, what happened is now that I had HIV, I became a minority within a minority within yet another minority. And this intersectionality only deepened my fragile sense of belonging in Turkey. For a long time, I thought this was because of the political climate in Turkey. If you don't know, they're currently trying to criminalize queer people, and even displaying public affection can result in you getting arrested for years. We don't know if this bill will be passed, but wouldn't be surprising if they do. But after years of therapy, I've come to realize it wasn't really about Turkey or the politics of Turkey, which in many ways will always be one of my homes. but it was more about me. My relationship with belonging has always been complicated. But what I've learned through my self-discovery journey is that the sense of belonging doesn't really come from the space for me, but it comes from the people that I can feel safe with, being with people that I can be fully myself around. And unfortunately, I couldn't do that in Turkey. And politics were basically just a cherry on top. And a bit more than a year after my HIV diagnosis, I did what many in my family have done for generations, and I migrated. Migration kind of runs in our family because I am the third generation to be born in a different country. These days, I'm still in Zurich, and I hope to stay put for a while because migration is exhausting. Even if it is to a previous home, it is still physically and emotionally draining. And the other thing about migration is when your chosen family is scattered around the world, things can get lonely sometimes. And in those moments, I find myself on series of phone calls talking with my loved ones for hours or journaling and trying to write down my emotions. And now recording myself and trying to make sense of it all in a podcast. Last time I was in Turkey, I found some of the old journals that I had left in my parents' house. And I noticed while reading through them, I've always written a lot when I'm traveling for work, especially during HIV-related meetings and capacity building programs or conferences. I think I write a lot during these travels because I'm trying to maybe capture the feelings I get when I meet with other people who are living with HIV or who are affected by HIV, where we are probably at a conference or a capacity building program in a new city where we're all a little bit lost, but we're still learning from each other and advocating for our rights together. And some of the people that I met at these gatherings are now part of OurCARE. We are a collective of activists, researchers, and academics that I met along the way during what I now call second season of my self-discovery journey, which started with my HIV diagnosis. And honey, let me tell you, it has been a journey. We're talking about over 30 countries. I don't even know how many conferences on HIV, sexual health, queer rights, and harm reduction. And of course, a lot of sex, some substance use, some addiction, detoxing, relapsing, and of course, a lot of situationships with guys. Sometimes it's really overwhelming, and sometimes I can't help but be excited for what may be next. And OurCARE and this podcast is one of those things that I quietly dreamed about for a while until people around me push me to take the leap and finally go for it. In a way, it also feels like all the messy, scattered parts of my life that didn't make sense at the time, clicking into their place and things starting to make some sense, or at least to me. I was talking about the journals, and in one of those journals that I found at my parents' house, I found a quote that I have written from a tweet by the writer and activist Alexander Leon. And the tweet said, "Queer people don't grow up as ourselves. We grow up playing a version of ourselves that sacrifices authenticity to minimize humiliation and prejudice. The massive task of our adult lives is to unpick which parts of ourselves are truly us and which parts we have created to protect us." I remember the moment that I saw this tweet and I froze and looked at it for a couple of minutes. And if I think about it, I only truly started discovering who I am after moving to Istanbul when I was 18. That's when my little queer life started, so to say. Moving in with my partner, adopting our cat, going to my first Pride, volunteering at an NGO, starting to cruise, getting my first job. All of these happened for the first time in Istanbul. And Istanbul is always going to be my first true home where I built myself a home and started discovering who I am. What I didn't know back then, 4 years after moving to Istanbul, I would be getting diagnosed with HIV and things would get a lot queerer in my life. Shortly after my HIV diagnosis, while I was still in my room crying and thinking my life is over, everyone around me told me to reach out to this HIV organization in Istanbul. Back then, it was the only HIV organization, so I didn't really have a lot of options. And queer organizations didn't really do much in HIV other than promoting prevention. So I reached out to this organization and we arranged a meeting, but that meeting didn't really go well because I felt like they focused more on my test results than my emotional needs, which I had a lot of. And I also felt like they were low-key homophobic, but I didn't really say anything. I just left. And as I said at that time, queer organizations weren't really doing much on HIV. So I started reaching out to European organizations and looking out for any capacity building programs or training programs or anything that I could be a part of. And that's how I got accepted to a year-long training with the European AIDS Treatment Group, EATG for short. And honestly, that program literally blew my mind. And I think it would be fair to say it has changed the trajectory of my life. The program brought together 10 English speakers and 10 Russian speakers together. We had simultaneous translation throughout the program, and we met in 5 different European cities learning about HIV advocacy, research, clinical trials, harm reduction, health policies, you name it. That program covered so much. I remember I have saved everything and I would need to sit down after each meeting back home and I would properly study the material because I didn't know nothing and they were talking about things that I never heard of. So I properly sat down and studied for hours. And I think I actually still have the folders on my computer. But basically, the goal of this program was to bring various people from across Europe who are living with HIV or are affected by HIV or are working on HIV as healthcare providers or researchers. And the goal was to make our advocacy more informed, more intersectional, and more powerful. At the time, I had no idea how life-changing this program would be for me. And I know some people out there do not believe in capacity building or peer support, but genuinely, I do not know who that shy, introverted 22-year-old would have become without HIV and all the capacity building programs that I was so lucky to be a part of. Halfway through the program, EATG nominated me for a gathering in Lesotho, where a pharma company brought together young people living with and affected by HIV and working in HIV advocacy together. And that's really where things kicked off for me. It was the most empowering thing I have ever experienced in my life, being surrounded by people who are just as young as me, more informed than me, but just as young as me. And we were all trying to sort things out in our lives. And that's also where I met Mercy, who will be our first guest in our next episode. So we will pick up the story from there next time. Thank you so much for tuning in. I know we're living through some wild and overwhelming times, and it can feel like the world is collapsing on us, and it kind of is in many ways. So please take care of yourself, be gentle with your heart, and don't forget to reach out when you need to. There is always someone to listen to you and talk you through things. Until next time, bye.